system. From a small-town murder to a global cause célèbre, Reed's case is a tangled web of racial tensions, disputed evidence, and claims of a miscarriage of justice. But as new developments unfold, we're left to wonder, is Reed an innocent man facing death, or is this a last-ditch attempt to escape punishment? Let's delve into the heart of this chilling case. In 1996, the quiet town of Bastrop, Texas was shaken to its core when 19-year-old Stacy Stites was found partially unclothed and strangled. Her body was discovered just hours after she failed to show up for her shift at the local grocery store. The murder weapon? Pieces of her own belt found at the crime scene and near her fiancé's abandoned truck. Initially, suspicion fell on Jimmy Fennell, Stites' fiancé, but the case took a dramatic turn when, a year later, DNA evidence entered the picture. Sperm cells matching Rodney Reed were found inside the victim's body. The prosecution's theory? Reed had raped and killed Stites. Reed, however, claimed he and Stites were having a consensual affair. But in rural Texas, the idea of a relationship between a black man and a white woman raised eyebrows. Reed faced an all-white jury, adding a layer of racial tension to an already volatile case. The evidence seemed damning, but was it the full picture? As we'll see, this case is far from black and white, with twists and turns that continue to raise questions about the true nature of justice in America. In a stunning turn of events, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals has delivered a crushing blow to Rodney Reed's fight for freedom. Nearly 4 years after halting his execution, the court has emphatically rejected Reed's claim of innocence. This decision comes as a shock to many who have been following the case closely. The court's ruling, spanning an impressive 129 pages, leaves little room for interpretation. Judge Jesse McClure, writing for the majority in a 7-1 decision, stated that even when considering all of Reed's post-trial evidence, he has failed to demonstrate that he is more likely than not innocent of Stacy's murder. This ruling accepts the 2021 recommendation of retired State District Judge J.D. Langley, who found Reed's new evidence pointing suspicion towards Jimmy Fennell not credible. The court's decision effectively slams the door on Reed's hopes for a new trial, a devastating setback for a man who has spent more than a quarter-century on death row. However, this may not be the end of the road for Reed. Despite this major setback, he likely won't face an immediate execution date. The U.S. Supreme Court recently sided with Reed in another appeal, opening the door for him to pursue DNA testing on evidence used to convict him. This glimmer of hope keeps Reed's fight for exoneration alive, even as the clock continues to tick. Over the years, Rodney Reed's legal team has presented a mountain of new evidence and witnesses in an attempt to prove his innocence. One of the key elements of this new evidence supports Reed's claim of a consensual relationship with Stacy Stites. Several witnesses have come forward corroborating that Reed and Stites were indeed involved romantically. This testimony directly challenges the prosecution's narrative that Reed was a stranger who attacked Stites. Additionally, Reed's attorneys have brought forward pathologists who dispute the original timeline of Stites' death. These experts suggest that Stites was likely killed earlier than initially thought, during a time when she was alone with her fiancé, Jimmy Fennell. Perhaps most shockingly, the medical examiner who originally testified about the time of death has since clarified that it would be impossible to pinpoint the exact time Stites died. This revelation casts doubt on the prosecution's entire theory of the crime. However, it's important to note that Bastrop County prosecutors and Stites' family strongly deny these claims. They question the credibility of witnesses who waited years to come forward and remain certain of Reed's guilt. The introduction of this new evidence has certainly complicated the case, raising questions about the initial investigation and trial. But as we'll see, the courts have been reluctant to accept these new elements as definitive proof of Reed's innocence. As the investigation into Stacy Stites' murder unfolded, suspicion began to shift towards an unexpected figure, Jimmy Fennell, Stites' own fiancé. Initially considered a suspect, Fennell's involvement took a back seat when DNA evidence linked Reed to the crime. But the story doesn't end there. Fennell's past paints a troubling picture. In 2007, while serving as a police officer, he was convicted of kidnapping and sexually assaulting a woman while on duty. This shocking revelation landed him behind bars for a decade, raising serious questions about his character and potential involvement in Stites' death. Reed's legal team has brought forward witnesses who claim Fennell was abusive towards Stites. Some even allege that Fennell suspected Stites of having an affair with a black man, adding a disturbing racial element to the case. Perhaps most intriguing is the testimony of forensic experts who argue that Stites was likely killed earlier than initially thought, during a time when she would have been alone with Fennell. This timing discrepancy has cast a long shadow of doubt over Fennell's original alibi. Despite these revelations, prosecutors and Stites' family remain convinced of Reed's guilt. They dismiss the new witnesses as unreliable, questioning why they waited so long to come forward. The battle between Reed's supporters and those who believe in his guilt continues to rage on, with Jimmy Fennell at the center of the storm. Now let's dive into the heart of this case, the court's decision. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals delivered a crushing blow to Rodney Reed in a 129-page ruling. Judge Jesse McClure, writing for the majority in a 7-1 decision, stated that even when considering all of Reed's post-trial evidence, he still hasn't shown that he's more likely than not innocent of Stacy's murder. The court meticulously examined each piece of evidence raised by both Reed and the state over the decades of litigation. They scrutinized the credibility of evidence suggesting a consensual relationship between Stites and Reed, as well as testimony implicating Fennell as the killer. Ultimately, the court concluded that Reed's new evidence fell short of what Judge McClure called the Herculean task of demonstrating actual innocence. They acknowledged that Reed might have been in a better position at trial with these new witnesses, but emphasized that this is far from proving that no rational juror could have convicted him. The court also addressed Reed's claim that the state withheld evidence from the defense before the trial. However, they doubted the truth behind these statements and ruled that Reed didn't meet the burden of proof to show that prosecutors had suppressed this evidence. This decision has sparked outrage among Reed's supporters, with his attorney Jane Pucker condemning it as allowing prosecutorial misconduct to go unchecked. The ruling raises serious questions about the standards of proving innocence and the handling of evidence in our justice system. As we wrap up today's episode, it's clear that the Rodney Reed case raises serious questions about our justice system. Can we truly be certain of guilt when new evidence emerges decades later? Does our system adequately protect against racial bias? These are issues we must grapple with as a society. What do you think? Has justice been served in this case, or is there more to uncover? Share your thoughts in the comments and join us next time for another deep dive into true crime. Welcome to the Real Crime Diary Daily Dose of Crime. Today, we dive into a shocking case that spans over half a century, involving the world's longest-serving death row inmate. What happens when justice takes 58 years to unfold? Brace yourselves for a tale of injustice, perseverance, and a legal system put to the test. Picture this. It's 1966 in Japan. A horrific crime sends shockwaves through the nation. 4 people brutally murdered, their bodies discovered in a burned-out home. Enter Iwao Hakamada, a former boxer, who soon finds himself at the center of this gruesome tale. Despite his protests of innocence, Hakamada is convicted and sentenced to death. But this is just the beginning of an extraordinary story that would span over half a century. For 48 long years, Hakamada languished on death row, never wavering from his claim of innocence. His case would go on to become one of the most controversial in Japanese history, raising serious questions about the country's justice system and the very nature of truth itself. Picture this: a quiet town in central Japan, 1966. A prominent executive, his wife, and their 2 children are found dead in their burned-out home. The police are desperate for answers, and they think they've found their man in Iwao Hakamada, a local boxer. The trial that followed was swift and decisive. Prosecutors painted Hakamada as a cold-blooded killer, presenting evidence that seemed damning at the time. They claimed to have found blood-stained clothing hidden in a miso tank, linking Hakamada to the crime scene. His confession, obtained after intense interrogation, sealed his fate. Despite Hakamada's desperate pleas of innocence, the court found him guilty. In 1968, he was sentenced to death. But as the gavel fell, little did anyone know that this case was far from closed. The evidence that seemed so solid would soon start to crumble, leaving us to wonder what really happened on that fateful night. Imagine spending nearly 3 decades fighting for a chance to prove your innocence. That's exactly what Iwao Hakamada and his sister endured. Their battle for justice was a marathon, not a sprint. For 27 long years, they waited, only to have Hakamada's first appeal for a retrial denied. But they refused to give up. Then in 2014, a glimmer of hope appeared. New evidence emerged that cast doubt on Hakamada's conviction. This breakthrough was enough to secure his release from prison after 48 years behind bars. But freedom didn't mean the fight was over. The legal system moved at a glacial pace, with the case bouncing between courts for years. What was this new evidence that finally tipped the scales? And why did it take so long for the truth to come to light? As we'll see, the answers to these questions would shake the very foundations of the case against Hakamada. In a stunning turn of events, the truth behind Hakamada's conviction has finally come to light. The court's ruling was nothing short of groundbreaking, revealing a disturbing web of fabricated evidence and misconduct. At the heart of this revelation was the blood-stained clothing, supposedly worn by Hakamada during the murders. For years, this had been a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. But now, the court has concluded that these items were planted by investigators, a shocking abuse of power that tainted the entire investigation. But that's not all. DNA evidence, long considered the gold standard in forensic science, didn't match Hakamada. This crucial detail had been overlooked or deliberately ignored for decades. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the revelation about Hakamada's confession. The court found that it was obtained through inhumane interrogation techniques, raising serious questions about the ethics of the investigation and the reliability of confessions obtained under duress. As these pieces of the puzzle fell into place, the picture became clear. The evidence against Hakamada had been manipulated from the start. The truth, hidden for so long, was finally emerging from the shadows. After 58 long years, justice finally prevailed for Iwao Hakamada. The 88-year-old former boxer was acquitted of the charges that had haunted him for over half a century. This landmark decision has sent shockwaves through Japan's legal system, forcing a hard look at its practices. Japan's notoriously high conviction rate of over 99% has long been a subject of scrutiny. Hakamada's case throws this into sharp relief, raising uncomfortable questions about how many other innocent people might be behind bars or even on death row. The implications of this case stretch far beyond one man's freedom. It's reignited passionate debates about the death penalty in Japan, one of the few developed nations that still practices capital punishment. Critics argue that cases like Hakamada's prove the irreversible nature of the death penalty is too risky in a system where mistakes can and do happen. This acquittal could be a turning point for Japan's legal landscape. It may lead to reforms in interrogation practices, evidence handling, and the appeals process. More importantly, it might make judges and prosecutors more cautious about pursuing convictions at all costs. But the question remains, will this case be enough to spark real change? Or will it be seen as an isolated incident in an otherwise functional system? As we wrap up today's episode, the case of Iwao Hakamada serves as a chilling reminder of the potential for injustice within any legal system. 58 years. That's how long it took for the truth to finally come to light. It's a sobering thought that makes us question, how many others might be sitting behind bars, wrongfully convicted, their voices unheard? This case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the reliability of evidence, the pressure on investigators to solve high-profile cases, and the very nature of our justice systems. What safeguards can be put in place to prevent such tragedies in the future? How can we ensure that the pursuit of justice doesn't lead to the greatest injustice of all, the conviction of an innocent person? As we ponder these questions, I encourage you to share your thoughts. What do you think can be done to prevent wrongful convictions? How can we balance the need for justice with the protection of individual rights? Your insights could spark important conversations. Join us next time as we delve into another gripping true crime story, always seeking the truth in the complex world of criminal justice. Welcome to the Real Crime Diary, Daily Dose of Crime. I'm your host, MHB, and today we're diving into a case that's been 3 decades in the making. What happens when a convenience store robbery turns deadly, and the aftermath stretches across generations? That's the story we're unraveling today. On a seemingly ordinary day in 1992, Kenneth Mears was working at a Root and Scoot convenience store in Oklahoma City. Little did he know that this shift would be his last. Two men, Emmanuel Littlejohn and Glenn Bethany, entered the store. What began as a robbery quickly escalated, leaving Mears dead and setting off a chain of events that would culminate 32 years later. Fast forward to this Thursday, and we find ourselves at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister. At 10:01 a.m., the execution of Emmanuel Littlejohn began. By 10:17 a.m., Littlejohn was pronounced dead, marking the end of a long and controversial journey through the justice system. But let's rewind. How did we get here? The case against Littlejohn was built on witness testimony, stating he was the only one seen holding a firearm during the robbery. However, Littlejohn maintained his innocence until his final breath, insisting it was Bethany who fired the fatal shot. This discrepancy would become a point of contention that would echo through the years. Littlejohn's defense didn't stop at claims of innocence. His lawyer argued that he suffered from brain damage due to childhood trauma, impairing his cognitive abilities. This raised questions about his capacity to fully understand his actions and their consequences. But was it enough to sway the courts? As the case progressed through the legal system, it seemed the answer was no. Every appeal was exhausted, every legal avenue explored. The law, as interpreted by the courts, demanded that Littlejohn pay the ultimate price for his alleged crime. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Just days before the scheduled execution, the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board voted 3-2 in favor of recommending clemency for Littlejohn. This last-minute development brought a glimmer of hope to Littlejohn's supporters. Would Governor Kevin Stitt grant clemency and spare Littlejohn's life? The answer, as we now know, was no. Stitt, describing himself as a law and order governor, chose not to overturn the jury's decision. In a statement, he acknowledged the difficulty of the decision, but emphasized the importance of respecting the judicial process. As the execution proceeded, witnesses reported that Littlejohn's breathing seemed labored, his stomach rising and falling noticeably. By 10:09 a.m., he had stopped breathing altogether. His last words were touching, asking after his mother's well-being and expressing love for her and his daughter. The execution of Emmanuel Littlejohn marks the 209th in Oklahoma's history. It's a somber statistic that raises questions about the nature of justice, the reliability of eyewitness testimony, and the finality of capital punishment. Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond declared that justice has been served for the murder of Kenny Mears. He shared a message from the Mears family, expressing their appreciation for the various legal and correctional departments involved in bringing the case to its conclusion. But not everyone sees it that way. State Representative Jason Lowe voiced concerns about using the death penalty when doubts remain about a defendant's guilt. His statement serves as a reminder of the ongoing debate surrounding capital punishment in America. As we wrap up today's episode, we're left with more questions than answers. Was justice truly served? Could this case have been resolved differently? And what does this mean for future cases where guilt isn't absolutely certain? These are the questions we grapple with in the world of true crime. They're not easy to answer, but they're crucial to consider as we strive for a just and fair society. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Real Crime Diary. Until next time, stay vigilant and keep questioning. This is MHB signing off.
Welcome to The Real Crime Diary, Daily Dose of Crime. Today, we delve into a shocking execution that's making headlines and raising questions about justice and humanity. What happens when a controversial method of capital punishment is put to use? The case we're about to explore will challenge your perceptions and leave you questioning the very nature of our justice system. On Thursday evening, Alabama executed Alan Eugene Miller, a 59-year-old death row inmate, using a method that's stirring up intense debate across the nation. Miller was put to death by nitrogen hypoxia, marking only the second time this controversial execution method has been used in the United States. The execution took place at a prison in Atmore, where Miller was pronounced dead at 6:38 p.m. This case has thrust the spotlight onto nitrogen hypoxia, a method that involves replacing oxygen with 100% nitrogen gas, effectively suffocating the inmate. Critics argue that this method is tantamount to torture, raising serious ethical questions about its use in capital punishment. The controversy surrounding nitrogen hypoxia stems from concerns about the potential for prolonged suffering and the lack of extensive testing on humans. Miller's execution has reignited the debate over the humaneness and constitutionality of this method, with human rights advocates and medical professionals voicing strong opposition. As more states consider adopting nitrogen hypoxia for executions, Miller's case serves as a lightning rod for discussions about the future of capital punishment in America. The execution process of Alan Eugene Miller was a harrowing spectacle that has left many questioning the humanity of nitrogen hypoxia as a method of capital punishment. Witnesses described the disturbing scene as Miller was strapped to the gurney. For about 2 minutes, he shook and trembled violently, his body at times pulling against the restraints that held him down. This was followed by 6 agonizing minutes of periodic gulping breaths, a sight that sent chills down the spines of those present. Throughout this ordeal, nitrogen gas flowed into Miller's mask for approximately 15 minutes. Officials from the Alabama Department of Corrections insist that everything went according to plan and followed their established protocol. Commissioner John Hamm stated that the involuntary body movements were expected as the body was depleted of oxygen. However, the eyewitness accounts paint a picture that seems far from the quick and painless death that proponents of this method have promised. The prolonged duration of visible distress raises serious questions about the humaneness of nitrogen hypoxia as an execution method. Is this really a more ethical alternative to other forms of capital punishment, or are we witnessing a new form of cruel and unusual punishment? Let's turn back the clock to 1999, when Alan Eugene Miller's name first became synonymous with a horrific crime. Miller was convicted of brutally murdering 3 men: Lee Holdbricks, Scott Yancey, and Terry Lee Jarvis. His motive? He believed these men were spreading rumors about him. But Miller's story didn't end with his conviction. For over 2 decades, he was embroiled in a complex legal battle that would challenge the very nature of how we carry out capital punishment. In September 2022, Alabama attempted to execute Miller by lethal injection. However, in a twist that sounds more like a dark comedy than real life, officials couldn't find a suitable vein before the execution warrant expired. This botched attempt led to further legal wrangling. Miller then sued the state, challenging their nitrogen hypoxia protocol on the grounds that it could cause undue suffering. It's a case that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about what constitutes humane execution, if such a thing exists at all. Nitrogen hypoxia as an execution method has sparked intense debate in the criminal justice world. Supporters argue it's a more humane alternative to lethal injection, claiming it causes rapid unconsciousness and a painless death. But medical experts aren't so sure. They warn that the effects of pure nitrogen on the human body are largely unknown and potentially devastating. The United Nations didn't mince words after the first nitrogen hypoxia execution earlier this year. They condemned it as nothing short of state-sanctioned torture. This harsh criticism stems from witness accounts describing prolonged suffering during the procedure. Despite the controversy, some states are pushing forward. Alabama, Oklahoma, Mississippi, and Louisiana have all authorized nitrogen hypoxia for executions. As more states consider adopting this method, the ethical questions only grow louder. Is this truly a more humane way to carry out capital punishment, or are we venturing into dangerous, uncharted territory? As we wrap up today's episode, we're left with unsettling questions about the ethics and effectiveness of capital punishment. The execution of Alan Eugene Miller by nitrogen hypoxia has reignited debates about humane methods of execution and whether such methods can truly exist. What are your thoughts on this controversial execution method? Do you believe it's a step forward in making capital punishment more humane, or is it just another form of cruel and unusual punishment? Share your opinions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories that challenge our understanding of justice. Until next time, this is MHB signing off from the Real Crime Diary.
What happens when a seemingly simple crime turns into a national headline, spanning decades and challenging the very foundations of our justice system? Today, we dive into one of the most shocking cases that left investigators baffled and continues to raise questions about intellectual disability and the death penalty. Welcome to The Real Crime Diary, Daily Dose of Crime. I'm your host, MHB. and we're about to unravel a chilling case from Texas that will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice and morality. Picture a quiet neighborhood in Houston, Texas, in 1989. The kind of place where neighbors wave to each other and kids play on the street. But on one fateful day, this peaceful community was shattered by an unthinkable act of violence. Bonita Edwards, a 38-year-old widow, lived in an apartment with her twin 16-year-old daughters, Burnett and Annette. Their home, once a sanctuary, became the scene of a horrific crime that would haunt the city for years to come. On December 2nd, Bonita's concerned boyfriend made a grisly discovery. All three women had been brutally stabbed to death. The crime scene was shocking. A mother and her two teenage daughters, their lives cut tragically short in their own home. As news of the murders spread, fear gripped the community. Who could have committed such a heinous act? Despite an intensive investigation, leads were scarce. Neighbors had seen and heard nothing suspicious. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting the killer might have been someone known to the family. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. The case of the Edwards family murders went cold, leaving a community in fear and a family without justice. For 6 long years, the killer walked free, while the memory of Bonita, Burnett, and Annette faded from headlines but never from the hearts of those who knew them. Little did anyone know, the truth behind this brutal crime was yet to be revealed, and when it finally came to light, it would shock everyone all over again. Garcia Glenn White, born in 1963, wasn't just any suspect. He was a man with a dark history that would send chills down anyone's spine. Before the Edwards family murders came to light, White had already left a trail of violence in his wake. In the autumn of 1989, White had a heated argument with a 27-year-old prostitute named Greta Williams at a crack house in Houston. The dispute turned deadly, and Williams lost her life. At the time, White managed to slip away unnoticed, the killing remaining unsolved. But White's violent tendencies didn't stop there. In July 1995, he struck again. This time, his target was a convenience store in Houston. Along with an accomplice, White attempted to rob the store, resulting in the death of the clerk, Hy Van Pham. It was during the investigation of this convenience store murder that White's involvement in the Edwards family murders came to light. In a twist of fate, White's own acquaintance, Tecumseh Manuel, revealed to investigators that White had confessed to the 1989 triple homicide. Cornered during interrogation for the convenience store killing, White initially denied any involvement in the Edwards case. But as the pressure mounted and portions of Manuel's interview were presented to him, White's facade crumbled. He finally admitted his responsibility for the gruesome murders that had haunted Houston for years. The investigation took a surprising turn when White initially spun a tale involving an accomplice named Terrence Moore. He claimed they had gone to Bonita's apartment together, intending to use drugs and have sex. According to this fabricated story, Moore was the one who stabbed Bonita and her daughters while White merely fondled one of the girls. However, this lie quickly unraveled when investigators discovered that Moore had died 4 months before the murders took place. Confronted with this fact, White crumbled and admitted he was solely responsible for the horrific crimes. The breakthrough in the case came when DNA and serology tests were conducted. These tests identified White's semen and blood samples at the crime scene, providing irrefutable evidence of his guilt. This scientific evidence was the final piece of the puzzle that investigators needed to close the case. In May 1996, nearly 7 years after the murders, a grand jury indicted White for the murders of Burnett and Annette Edwards. The inclusion of sexual assault charges made it a capital case. Just 2 months later, White faced trial. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury found him guilty. Given the brutality of the crimes and the young age of 2 of the victims, White was sentenced to death. For nearly 3 decades, Garcia White has been fighting for his life through the legal system. His attorneys have left no stone unturned in their efforts to overturn his death sentence. One of the primary battlegrounds has been White's confession. His lawyers have argued that it shouldn't be admissible in court, claiming that investigators took advantage of White's intellectual limitations during the interrogation process. They've painted a picture of a vulnerable man, manipulated into incriminating himself without fully understanding his rights. Then there's the DNA evidence. White's defense team has raised questions about its reliability, pointing to the troubled history of the Houston Police Department's crime lab. They've suggested that inconsistencies in the testing could cast doubt on White's guilt. But perhaps the most compelling argument put forth by White's attorneys centers on his intellectual capacity. They've consistently maintained that White's low IQ and adaptive deficits should render him ineligible for the death penalty. They've presented evidence of his struggles with basic life skills, decision-making, and abstract thinking, arguing that executing someone with these limitations would be unconstitutional. Despite these persistent efforts, the courts have remained unmoved. Time and again, judges have rejected White's appeals, leaving him to face the ultimate punishment. It's a stark reminder of the uphill battle faced by death row inmates, even when questions of intellectual disability are at play. Fast forward to the present day, and Garcia White, now 60 years old, finds himself facing a grim reality. The state of Texas has set his execution date for October 1, 2024. This date looms large, not just for White, but for those following his case and the broader debate on capital punishment. If the execution proceeds as planned, White will become the 5th person put to death by Texas this year alone. This continues a troubling trend in the Lone Star State, where officials seem intent on carrying out death sentences for inmates who arrived on death row during the 1990s, a time when the death penalty was at its peak popularity among juries. It's worth noting that 4 out of the 5 executions in Texas this year have involved Black or Hispanic individuals, raising questions about racial disparities in the application of the death penalty. White's case adds another layer to this ongoing discussion. The execution of long-serving death row inmates like White also brings into focus the psychological toll of decades spent awaiting death. Some argue that such prolonged periods on death row constitute cruel and unusual punishment in themselves. The case of Garcia White brings to the forefront several ethical dilemmas surrounding capital punishment. One of the most pressing issues is the role of intellectual disability in death penalty cases. White's attorneys have consistently argued that his low IQ and cognitive deficits should make him ineligible for execution. This touches on a broader debate about whether individuals with intellectual disabilities can truly understand the nature of their crimes or the consequences of their actions. Another ethical consideration is the extraordinary length of time White has spent on death row, 28 years. This raises questions about the psychological impact of such prolonged confinement and whether it constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. Some argue that decades of living under the shadow of execution is a form of torture in itself. The case also reignites concerns about the reliability of confessions and forensic evidence in capital cases. White's initial confession was challenged on the grounds that his intellectual disability may have made him more susceptible to manipulation during interrogation. Similarly, the DNA evidence in his case came under scrutiny due to issues with the crime lab's practices. These factors combined paint a complex picture of the ethical landscape surrounding the death penalty. They force us to confront difficult questions about justice, mercy, and the limitations of our legal system. As society continues to grapple with these issues, cases like White's serve as a stark reminder of the high stakes involved in capital punishment. As Garcia White's execution date approaches, the debate surrounding his case continues to intensify. This complex and controversial case raises numerous questions about our justice system, the application of the death penalty, and the role of intellectual disability in capital punishment. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe justice is being served, or are there still unanswered questions? We'd love to hear your opinions in the comments section. Join us next time for another deep dive into true crime on The Real Crime Diary, where we'll continue to explore the most perplexing and thought-provoking cases in criminal history.
What happens when the walls of a maximum security prison can't contain the violence of those within? Today, we dive into a chilling case that left even hardened correctional officers stunned. Welcome, listeners, to The Real Crime Diary, Daily Dose of Crime. I'm your host, MHB, and in this episode, we're exploring a shocking incident that unfolded behind the iron bars of a Southern California prison. A powerful mafia member, already sentenced to death, met a brutal and unexpected end at the hands of his fellow inmates. This is a story of power, violence, and the harsh realities of life on death row. Brace yourselves as we unravel the events that led to this bloody climax in one of America's most secure facilities. It was just another day at Calipatria State Prison in Imperial County, California. The routine hum of prison life buzzed through the corridors and yards. But at 1:23 p.m., that routine was shattered. Prison staff witnessed a chilling scene unfold. One inmate, later identified as 25-year-old Tyler A. Lua, suddenly attacked another prisoner. The victim, Alberto Martinez, fell to the ground under the brutal assault. But this was just the beginning. As Martinez lay motionless, Lua stepped away. Then, in a horrifying turn of events, two more inmates joined the attack. Jorge D. Negrete Larios and Luis J. Beltran descended upon the helpless Martinez, continuing the vicious beating. The prison staff sprang into action. They deployed pepper spray and even resorted to a baton strike to stop the savage assault. Their swift response likely prevented an even more gruesome outcome. But for Martinez, it was already too late. Despite being rushed to the prison's triage area, he was pronounced dead less than an hour later. The cause? Injuries consistent with an inmate-manufactured weapon. In fact, two such weapons were found at the scene of this brutal crime. Now, let's turn our attention to the victim in this brutal prison attack, Alberto Martinez. At 46 years old, Martinez was no ordinary inmate. His story is one of power, influence, and a life steeped in organized crime. Martinez's journey to death row began in 2010 when he was convicted for his role in a chilling plot. Acting as the getaway driver, he participated in a failed attempt to kidnap and murder a businessman in Buena Park. But this wasn't just any random crime. The mastermind behind this sinister plan? The businessman's own sister. However, Martinez's notoriety extends far beyond this single act. He was a significant player in the Mexican mafia, wielding considerable influence even from behind bars. While on death row, Martinez continued to orchestrate murders, showcasing the reach of his power and the depth of his criminal connections. But perhaps most intriguing is how Martinez managed to maintain these connections. Despite being in one of the most secure environments imaginable, he somehow acquired an illegal cell phone. This device became his lifeline to the outside world, allowing him to not only continue his criminal activities but also to forge a romantic relationship with a woman in Mexico. Martinez's story serves as a stark reminder of the complex web of power and influence that can exist even within the confines of a maximum security prison. His life and death raise troubling questions about the effectiveness of our justice system in containing and reforming even the most hardened criminals. But who were these three inmates responsible for such a brutal attack? Let's dive into their backgrounds and try to understand what might have driven them to such violence. First, we have Tyler A. Lua, the 25-year-old who initiated the assault. Lua was serving a 19-year sentence for attempted second-degree murder with a firearm enhancement. While in prison, he racked up additional time for possessing controlled substances. This suggests a pattern of violent behavior and disregard for rules, even behind bars. Next is Jorge D. Negrete Larios, 33 years old, serving over 32 years for attempted second-degree murder. His sentence included enhancements for inflicting great bodily injury, discharging a firearm, and gang-related activity. These details paint a picture of a man deeply entrenched in violent gang culture. Finally, there's Luis J. Beltran, the youngest at 31. Beltran was facing the harshest sentence of the three, life without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder. He also had firearm enhancements and a previous felony conviction. What drove these men to attack Martinez? Was it a premeditated act of gang violence? A power struggle within the prison hierarchy? Or perhaps a personal vendetta? The presence of inmate-manufactured weapons at the scene suggests this wasn't a spontaneous act of rage, but a planned assault. As we peel back the layers of this case, it becomes clear that the prison system houses a complex web of allegiances, rivalries, and unfinished business from the outside world. The violent histories of these attackers merged in a perfect storm of brutality, leaving us to wonder, in a place designed to rehabilitate, how can such savage acts still occur? In the wake of this brutal attack, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation swiftly implemented measures to contain the situation and begin their investigation. The three suspects Lua, Negrete Larios, and Beltran were immediately moved to restricted housing, isolating them from the general prison population. This not only serves as a punishment but also prevents any potential retaliation or further violence. The prison yard where the attack occurred was placed under limited movement, a standard procedure to maintain order and gather evidence. 2 inmate-manufactured weapons were recovered from the scene, crucial pieces of evidence that will likely play a significant role in the ongoing investigation. As for the broader consequences, this incident will undoubtedly lead to a thorough review of security protocols at Calipatria State Prison. Questions will be raised about how these inmates were able to obtain or create weapons, and how such a violent attack could occur in a high-security environment. The death of a high-profile inmate like Martinez will also likely prompt an examination of inmate classification and housing procedures, especially for those with known gang affiliations. This tragedy may serve as a catalyst for stricter measures and increased vigilance in California's prison system. This shocking incident at Calipatria State Prison raises serious questions about safety within our high-security correctional facilities. How could such a violent attack occur in a place designed to house the most dangerous offenders? It's a stark reminder that even in the most controlled environments, danger lurks. But there's more to consider here. This event also shines a spotlight on the complex state of California's death row. In 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom signed an executive order placing a moratorium on the death penalty in California. This decision not only halted executions but also called for the closure of the state's execution chamber at San Quentin. So, we're left with a perplexing situation. Inmates like Alberto Martinez remain on death row, but with no prospect of execution. This limbo state creates its own set of challenges for prison management and inmate dynamics. Are these prisoners, knowing they won't face execution, more prone to violent behavior? Or does this moratorium offer an opportunity for reform? As we grapple with these questions, one thing is clear: the intersection of justice, safety, and human rights in our prison system is more complex than ever. And there you have it, folks. A chilling tale of prison violence that leaves us with more questions than answers. The brutal attack on Alberto Martinez, a powerful Mexican mafia member, by 3 fellow inmates shakes our understanding of safety even in the most secure facilities. It forces us to confront the harsh realities of life behind bars and the complex dynamics at play in our correctional system. As we reflect on this incident, we can't help but wonder, is true justice being served in our prisons? How can we ensure the safety of inmates, even those on death row? And what does this say about the effectiveness of our current approach to incarceration and rehabilitation? These are tough questions without easy answers. But they're questions we need to keep asking and discussing as a society. What are your thoughts on this incident? How do you think we can improve safety and justice in our prison system? We'd love to hear your perspective. Keep the conversation going in the comments section. And if you want to stay up to date with more gripping true crime stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to The Real Crime Diary. Until next time, stay safe and stay informed.
What happens when justice becomes a form of torture? Today, we dive into a shocking case that exposes the inhumane practice of solitary confinement for death row inmates. Recent rulings are challenging this controversial system, and the revelations are nothing short of disturbing. Prepare yourselves for a journey into the dark corners of our prison system, where isolation becomes a sentence worse than death itself. Imagine being locked in a small room, barely larger than a parking space, for 22 hours a day, with little to no human contact. This is the reality for many death row inmates across America. The effects of such prolonged isolation are devastating, especially for those with pre-existing mental health conditions. Scientists and experts unanimously agree that indefinite or prolonged solitary confinement causes serious harm. It can lead to severe psychological distress, cognitive impairment, and even physical health problems. For those already struggling with mental illness, the consequences can be catastrophic. The United Nations has taken a strong stance on this issue, declaring that solitary confinement amounts to torture. Yet, as of 2020, a dozen states in the U.S. routinely kept death-sentenced prisoners in these extreme conditions for years on end. It's a practice that raises serious questions about human rights and the ethical treatment of prisoners in our justice system. Now let's turn our attention to a case that's been making waves in Tennessee. Krista Pike, the only woman on the state's death row, has spent an astonishing 28 years in what amounts to functional solitary confinement. Imagine being trapped in a cell the size of a parking space for nearly 3 decades with almost no human contact. Pike's situation was unique and particularly harsh. While male death row inmates in Tennessee were allowed to socialize and work together, Pike was denied these basic opportunities for human interaction. She had no access to educational or religious programming, and virtually no physical contact with another human being. But there's been a significant development in Pike's case. Just this week, she reached a settlement with the state that will dramatically change her living conditions. The agreement will allow her to work and socialize with other women in the general prison population. This means shared meals, more time out of her cell, and the chance for meaningful human interaction after years of isolation. Pike's attorney called this settlement life-changing, emphasizing the devastating impact that prolonged solitary confinement has had on her client's mental and physical health. This case shines a spotlight on the controversial practice of solitary confinement and raises important questions about human rights in our prison system. Now let's turn our attention to Pennsylvania, where a groundbreaking legal battle has unfolded. Roy Williams, a prisoner with a lifelong history of serious mental illness, took on the state's Department of Corrections in a lawsuit that's sending shockwaves through the justice system. Williams alleged that he was subjected to 26 years of solitary confinement, a practice that experts say can cause severe psychological damage even in healthy individuals. For someone with pre-existing mental health conditions, the effects can be catastrophic. Initially, a federal district court dismissed Williams's claims. But in a stunning turn of events, the Third Circuit Court of Appeals overturned that decision. They ruled that Williams's case could proceed, stating that individuals with known histories of serious mental illness have a clearly established right not to be subjected to prolonged, indefinite solitary confinement without justification. This ruling is a significant blow to Pennsylvania's controversial solitary confinement policies and could pave the way for similar cases across the country. Now, let's delve into the shocking details of Pennsylvania's solitary confinement practices. In 2014, a U.S. Department of Justice investigation unveiled a horrifying reality for death row inmates in the state. These prisoners were confined to tiny 7 by 12-foot cells around the clock, deprived of basic human necessities. They were barred from educational courses, vocational opportunities, and even group religious services. The conditions were nothing short of inhumane. Imagine living in a cell with no natural light, artificial lights blazing 24/7, and poor ventilation that left the air thick with the stench of human waste. But it gets worse. Officials punished mentally ill prisoners who exhibited symptoms of their conditions in the most cruel ways imaginable. They'd deny them running water and bedding, strip them of their clothes, and even place them in full-body restraints for over 7 hours at a time. The DOJ's conclusion was damning. Pennsylvania's use of solitary confinement for people with serious mental illness violated both the 8th Amendment and the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was a system designed to break the human spirit, with little regard for the devastating consequences on the inmate's mental health. Let's take a closer look at the cases of Krista Pike and Roy Williams. Both of these individuals suffer from organic brain damage and psychiatric disorders, making them especially vulnerable to the devastating effects of solitary confinement. Krista Pike's story is particularly heartbreaking. Exposed to alcohol in the womb, her brain development was compromised from the start. Her childhood was marred by abuse, neglect, and multiple violent rapes, leading to severe mental illness. These early traumas left her ill-equipped to cope with the extreme isolation of solitary confinement. Roy Williams' case is equally disturbing. He had already battled serious mental illness for half his life before entering Pennsylvania's custody. Once on death row, the crushing weight of isolation proved too much, and he attempted suicide. Experts agree that individuals with pre-existing mental health conditions are at a significantly higher risk of deterioration when subjected to prolonged solitary confinement. The lack of human contact, sensory deprivation, and constant isolation can exacerbate their symptoms, potentially leading to irreversible psychological damage. These cases highlight the urgent need for reform in our prison systems, especially when it comes to the treatment of mentally ill inmates on death row. As we wrap up today's episode, let's reflect on the changing landscape of solitary confinement practices in our prison system. We've seen how recent rulings for Krista Pike and Roy Williams have challenged the status quo, recognizing the severe harm caused by prolonged isolation, especially for those with pre-existing mental health conditions. These cases shine a light on a dark corner of our justice system, forcing us to confront the ethical implications of such practices. As society evolves, so too must our approach to incarceration and rehabilitation. What are your thoughts on this issue? Do you think these rulings will lead to widespread changes in how we treat death row inmates? Share your opinions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into true crime stories that challenge our perceptions of justice. Welcome to the Real Crime Diary Daily Dose of Crime. What happens when a controversial medical diagnosis leads to a death sentence? Today, we dive into a shocking case that could make history: the potential first execution for shaken baby syndrome in the United States. This episode will challenge our understanding of justice and medical science, as we unravel a story that has left investigators, doctors, and the public questioning everything they thought they knew about child abuse and criminal responsibility. In the heart of Texas, a man's life hangs in the balance as the clock ticks towards October 17th. Robert Roberson, convicted of capital murder in the death of his 2-year-old daughter back in 2002, now faces execution. But this isn't just any death penalty case. Roberson's conviction rests on a controversial diagnosis: shaken baby syndrome. For nearly 2 decades, Roberson has maintained his innocence. Now, with time running out, he's making a desperate plea for clemency to Governor Greg Abbott. This case has thrown a spotlight on the evolving science behind shaken baby syndrome and raised serious questions about our justice system. If the execution proceeds, Roberson could become the first person in U.S. history to be put to death based on this disputed diagnosis. The stakes couldn't be higher, not just for Roberson, but for the future of similar cases across the country. Let's turn back the clock to January 31st, 2002. It was a night that would change Robert Roberson's life forever. According to Roberson, he awoke in the early hours to a strange cry. He found his 2-year-old daughter, Nikki, had fallen out of bed. After comforting her, they both went back to sleep. But the real nightmare began hours later. Roberson woke up to find Nikki wasn't breathing. Her lips had turned blue. In a panic, he rushed her to the emergency room. The doctors' faces grew grim as they examined the little girl. They concluded she was showing signs of brain death. The following day, Nikki was pronounced dead. The medical team noted a head injury, bleeding, brain swelling, and retinal hemorrhaging. A doctor in Dallas made a diagnosis that would seal Roberson's fate: shaken baby syndrome. Before an autopsy was even completed, Roberson found himself arrested. The speed at which he went from a concerned father to a murder suspect was dizzying. The night that began with a strange cry ended with Roberson behind bars, facing the gravest of charges. In 2003, Robert Roberson faced a capital murder trial that would ultimately lead to his conviction and death sentence. The prosecution's case hinged on the testimony of medical experts who diagnosed Nikki's death as a result of shaken baby syndrome. They painted a picture of a father who violently shook his daughter, causing fatal brain injuries. Detective Brian Wharton's testimony proved crucial. He described Roberson's seemingly emotionless demeanor at the hospital, interpreting it as a sign of guilt. This behavior, which would later be attributed to undiagnosed autism, was used to portray Roberson as cold and uncaring. The defense faced significant limitations. They were not allowed to present expert testimony about Roberson's mental lapses caused by a brain injury. This crucial information could have provided context for his behavior and decision-making. Perhaps most critically, Roberson's autism spectrum disorder, only diagnosed in 2018, went unrecognized during the trial. This undiagnosed condition likely affected how he appeared to others, including law enforcement and the jury, potentially influencing their perception of his guilt. The prosecution's narrative, combined with these limitations on the defense, led to Roberson's conviction. It's a stark reminder of how undiagnosed conditions and evolving medical understanding can impact the course of justice. The concept of shaken baby syndrome emerged in the 1970s as a way to explain serious head injuries in infants. For decades, it was widely accepted in medical and legal circles. However, as with many areas of science, our understanding has evolved significantly over time. Today, experts recognize that the symptoms once thought to be clear indicators of abuse can actually stem from a variety of causes. Shortfalls with head impact or even naturally occurring diseases like pneumonia can mimic what was previously attributed solely to violent shaking. In 2009, the American Academy of Pediatrics took a significant step by changing the terminology. They moved away from shaken baby syndrome to the broader term abusive head trauma. This shift acknowledges that injuries can result from mechanisms other than shaking alone. Dr. Andy Asnes, a pediatrics professor at Yale, emphasizes the complexity of diagnosing abusive head trauma. She stresses that context is crucial and no diagnosis can be made without extensive analysis and important background information. Simply observing certain symptoms isn't enough to determine the cause. Asnes highlights the critical importance of a child's full medical history in making an accurate diagnosis. This underscores a key issue in many cases: the need for a comprehensive review of all available medical information before reaching conclusions. As our understanding continues to evolve, it raises important questions about past convictions based on what we now know to be an oversimplified view of head trauma in infants. The implications for cases like Robert Robertson's are profound, potentially highlighting a miscarriage of justice based on outdated science. Now let's delve into a crucial aspect of this case that has been largely overlooked: Nikki's pre-existing health conditions. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn. According to Robertson's defense team, Nikki was chronically ill in the days leading up to her death. She had been taken to the hospital multiple times due to persistent respiratory issues and fever. This paints a very different picture from the healthy child prosecutors portrayed. The defense contends that based on reanalyzed post-mortem reports, Nikki was suffering from undiagnosed pneumonia. This condition could have hindered her ability to take in oxygen, potentially causing the brain swelling that was initially attributed to abuse. But that's not all. The defense also raises concerns about medication given to Nikki. They claim she was administered a high level of a drug that is no longer prescribed for children as young as she was. This raises serious questions about whether the medical treatment she received might have contributed to her tragic death. These factors weren't adequately considered during the initial investigation. The focus on shaken baby syndrome seems to have overshadowed Nikki's complex medical history, potentially leading to a grave miscarriage of justice. In a stunning twist that could reshape this case, Detective Brian Wharton, the very man who once testified against Robert Robertson, has had a profound change of heart. Wharton, who played a crucial role in Robertson's conviction, now believes that no crime was actually committed. What led to this dramatic reversal? Wharton admits that his initial interpretation of Robertson's flat affect at the hospital was misguided. He now understands that there could have been other explanations for Robertson's demeanor, including his undiagnosed autism spectrum disorder. Moreover, Wharton says he's gained a better understanding of Nikki's medical history and diagnosis since the trial. He now regrets not having more information about her health conditions at the time of the investigation. In a powerful statement, Wharton declared, "I owe Robert nothing less." He feels a moral obligation to speak out in Robertson's defense, driven by his lifelong commitment to truth and justice. This unexpected turn raises critical questions about the case. Could Wharton's newfound perspective sway Governor Abbott's decision on clemency? And what does this reveal about the potential flaws in the original investigation and trial? With the execution date looming, the fight to save Robert Robertson's life has intensified. A diverse coalition has rallied behind him, creating a groundswell of support that spans political divides. Bipartisan groups of state legislators have joined forces, setting aside their differences in a united call for clemency. Medical experts have also stepped forward, lending their voices to challenge the outdated science that led to Robertson's conviction. They argue that our understanding of head trauma in infants has evolved significantly since 2002. Casting doubt on the original diagnosis of shaken baby syndrome. But the clock is ticking. Robertson's legal team is working tirelessly, submitting a clemency petition to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles. This board holds the key to Robertson's fate, as they must recommend clemency before Governor Abbott can intervene. The pressure is mounting on Governor Abbott, who has used his clemency powers sparingly in the past. Supporters are urging him to consider the new evidence, the changing science, and the growing doubts surrounding Roberson's conviction. This race against time underscores the high stakes of this case. If clemency is not granted, Roberson could become the first person in U.S. history to be executed based on a shaken baby syndrome diagnosis, setting a precedent that many fear could have far-reaching consequences for similar cases across the country. As we wrap up today's episode, it's clear that Robert Roberson's case is more than just another death row story. It's a pivotal moment that could reshape our understanding of both criminal justice and medical science. If Roberson is executed on October 17th, it will mark the first time in U.S. history that someone has been put to death based on a shaken baby syndrome diagnosis. This fact alone underscores the gravity of the situation and the far-reaching implications of this case. The evolving science behind shaken baby syndrome, now more broadly termed abusive head trauma, raises critical questions. How many other convictions might be called into question? How do we balance justice with our growing medical knowledge? Moreover, this case highlights the crucial need for thorough investigations that consider all aspects of a child's health history. It reminds us that in matters of life and death, no stone should be left unturned. As we await Governor Abbott's decision on clemency, we're left to ponder, what does justice truly look like in a case like this? And how do we ensure that our legal system keeps pace with scientific advancements? Your thoughts on this matter are important. We encourage you to share your perspectives and continue following this developing story. The outcome of Robert Roberson's case could set a precedent that affects countless future cases and lives. Remember, in the world of true crime, it's not just about the stories we tell, but the questions we ask and the changes we inspire. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed. Power, Pleasure, and Pain. A study of abuse through time. This book provides a detailed examination of how sexual violence and power dynamics have manifested across different historical periods, from ancient civilizations to the modern era. It explores how figures in positions of power used their influence to manipulate and exploit others, showing that the patterns of abuse we see today have deep historical roots. Many people struggle to grasp why abuse of power, particularly sexual violence, persists in modern society. By connecting historical events with contemporary cases, the book offers crucial insights into why such behaviors remain prevalent. The book analyzes infamous cases such as those of Harvey Weinstein, R. Kelly, and Dominique Pellicotte, drawing parallels between them and historical figures. This section highlights how the systemic abuse seen in recent times is not a new phenomenon, but part of an ongoing cultural issue. Through the lens of these modern examples, readers will gain a better understanding of how institutions, wealth, and power have historically shielded perpetrators from justice, contributing to their ability to continue harming others. The book explores the philosophy of libertarianism, particularly through the works of Marquis de Sade, to explain the disturbing ways in which pleasure, power, and cruelty have been intertwined. This provides readers with a deeper philosophical context to interpret modern-day scandals. Unlike other studies that focus solely on historical or contemporary cases, this book uniquely blends both, offering a full spectrum of how abuse is tied to power dynamics. It stands out by making philosophical connections that help readers understand the deeper societal issues at play. Welcome to the Real Crime Diary, Daily Dose of Crime. What happens when a long-dormant execution chamber suddenly springs back to life? Today, we're diving into a shocking case that's bringing South Carolina's death penalty back into the spotlight after a 13-year hiatus. Imagine a state that once led the nation in executions, suddenly falling silent for over a decade. Now, picture that same state gearing up to restart its death chamber with a controversial case that's raising eyebrows across the country. This isn't just any return to capital punishment. It's a tale of legal battles, ethical dilemmas, and a man whose life hangs in the balance. So buckle up, crime enthusiasts. We're about to unravel a story that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about justice and retribution. Let's dive into the case of Richard Moore, a man whose story has become a flashpoint in the debate over capital punishment. In 1999, Moore walked into a convenience store in Spartanburg County, South Carolina. What began as a botched robbery ended in tragedy with the death of store clerk James Mahoney. Here's where things get complicated. Moore was unarmed when he entered the store. It was only during the confrontation that he grabbed one of two guns Mahoney had on hand. This detail has become crucial in the argument against Moore's death sentence. In October 2001, Moore was found guilty and sentenced to death. But his attorneys argue that this case doesn't fit the profile of crimes typically punishable by death. They contend that Moore's actions, while resulting in a tragic loss of life, don't make him the worst of the worst for whom the death penalty is supposedly reserved. Adding another layer to this already complex case is the question of racial bias. Moore is black, and his jury was entirely non-African American. This disparity has raised serious concerns about the fairness of his trial and sentencing. As we consider Moore's case, we're forced to confront difficult questions. What truly constitutes a capital crime? How do we ensure fairness in our justice system? And ultimately, where do we draw the line when it comes to the ultimate punishment? South Carolina's return to capital punishment after a 13-year hiatus is a story of persistence and controversy. The state, once one of the most active in carrying out executions, found itself at a standstill due to a seemingly mundane issue: the inability to obtain lethal injection drugs. This shortage wasn't unique to South Carolina. Many pharmaceutical companies, facing ethical concerns and public pressure, stopped supplying drugs for executions. This left states scrambling for alternatives, and South Carolina was no exception. But where there's a will, there's a way. And South Carolina found its way through a controversial piece of legislation. The state passed a policy allowing the identity of drug suppliers to remain confidential. This move effectively shielded these suppliers from public scrutiny and potential backlash. With this new shield in place, South Carolina was able to secure the drugs needed to resume executions. The state now plans to use a single drug, pentobarbital, for lethal injections, a protocol similar to that used in federal executions. This solution, while effective in restarting the execution process, has raised ethical questions. Critics argue that the lack of transparency could lead to the use of untested or substandard drugs, potentially causing undue suffering during executions. Despite these concerns, South Carolina is moving forward. The state has ambitious plans, scheduling executions every 5 weeks. It's a stark reminder of how quickly the landscape of capital punishment can change, and the lengths some states will go to maintain this controversial practice. Now let's talk about something that sets South Carolina apart in the world of capital punishment. In this state, death row inmates have a choice. Yes, you heard that right, a choice in how they die. South Carolina offers 3 options: lethal injection, electrocution, or the recently reintroduced firing squad. It's a grim menu, to say the least. But it's a choice that Richard Moore and others on death row must make. The firing squad option is particularly noteworthy. It's a method that hasn't been used in the United States since 2010 in Utah. The fact that it's back on the table in South Carolina speaks volumes about the state's determination to carry out executions, despite the challenges they've faced with lethal injection drugs. If an inmate doesn't make a choice, they're automatically assigned the electric chair. It's a chilling default option, isn't it? In Moore's case, he had previously chosen the firing squad when lethal injection wasn't available. But now, with lethal injection back on the table, he faces this grave decision once again. This unique situation raises profound questions about the nature of justice and punishment in our society. Is offering a choice in method of execution a form of humanity, or does it add an extra layer of cruelty to an already grim process? As the execution date looms, Richard Moore's legal team is gearing up for a fierce battle. They're not just fighting for Moore's life, they're challenging the very foundations of his conviction. At the heart of their argument is a troubling claim. Racial bias may have tainted the entire process. Moore's attorney, Lindsey Vann, points out a stark fact. Despite Moore being black, his jury didn't include a single African-American member. This raises serious questions about the fairness of his trial and whether justice was truly served. But the legal team isn't stopping there. They're also petitioning Governor Henry McMaster for clemency, hoping to reduce Moore's sentence to life imprisonment without parole. It's a long shot, though. No South Carolina governor in modern history has ever granted clemency in a death penalty case. The team is also highlighting Moore's behavior behind bars. They say he's been a model prisoner, even offering to mentor fellow inmates. It's a powerful argument for rehabilitation over retribution. These challenges aren't just about Moore. They're shining a spotlight on the broader issues facing death row inmates across South Carolina. As the state ramps up its execution schedule, we're likely to see more cases like Moore's, each one forcing us to confront difficult questions about justice, race, and the ultimate punishment. As we look to the future of capital punishment in South Carolina, the state's plans are clear. They're not slowing down. With 4 more inmates set to face execution after Richard Moore, South Carolina is planning to carry out executions every 5 weeks. It's a stark contrast to the 13-year hiatus we've just witnessed. But while the execution chamber is ramping up, death row itself is shrinking. Back in 2011, South Carolina had 63 inmates on death row. Today, that number has dwindled to just 31. Successful appeals and natural causes have played a significant role in this decline. It's not just South Carolina making headlines in the world of capital punishment. Other states are also moving forward with their execution schedules. In Texas, Robert Leslie Robertson III is set to face execution on October 17th. On the same day, Alabama plans to execute Derek Ryan Dearman. And just a month later, on November 21st, Carrie Dale Grayson is scheduled to be put to death, also in Alabama. These upcoming executions across the country underscore the ongoing debate surrounding the death penalty in America. As South Carolina resumes its place among the states actively carrying out capital punishment, the eyes of the nation will be watching closely. As we wrap up today's episode, it's clear that the case of Richard Moore and South Carolina's return to capital punishment raises profound questions about justice, morality, and the role of the death penalty in our society. The complexities surrounding Moore's case, from the circumstances of the crime to the racial implications of his sentencing, highlight the ongoing debate about the fairness and effectiveness of capital punishment. While South Carolina moves forward with its plans to resume executions, the controversy surrounding this decision reminds us that the death penalty remains one of the most divisive issues in our criminal justice system. It challenges us to consider what true justice looks like and whether the state should have the power to take a life. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Do you believe the death penalty serves justice, or is it an outdated form of punishment? How do cases like Moore's shape your perspective? Share your opinions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth explorations of true crime and justice. Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning. Power, Pleasure, and Pain. A study of abuse through time. This book provides a detailed examination of how sexual violence and power dynamics have manifested across different historical periods, from ancient civilizations to the modern era. It explores how figures in positions of power used their influence to manipulate and exploit others, showing that the patterns of abuse we see today have deep historical roots. Many people struggle to grasp why abuse of power, particularly sexual violence, persists in modern society. By connecting historical events with contemporary cases, the book offers crucial insights into why such behaviors remain prevalent. The book analyzes infamous cases such as those of Harvey Weinstein, R. Kelly, and Dominique Pellicotte, drawing parallels between them and historical figures. This section highlights how the systemic abuse seen in recent times is not a new phenomenon, but part of an ongoing cultural issue. Through the lens of these modern examples, readers will gain a better understanding of how institutions, wealth, and power have historically shielded perpetrators from justice, contributing to their ability to continue harming others. The book explores the philosophy of libertarianism, particularly through the works of Marquis de Sade, to explain the disturbing ways in which pleasure, power, and cruelty have been intertwined. This provides readers with a deeper philosophical context to interpret modern-day scandals. Unlike other studies that focus solely on historical or contemporary cases, this book uniquely blends both, offering a full spectrum of how abuse is tied to power dynamics. It stands out by making philosophical connections that help readers understand the deeper societal issues at play. Welcome to the Real Crime Diary, Daily Dose of Crime. Today, we delve into a shocking case that's made its way to the Supreme Court. What happens when a death row inmate and a state attorney general join forces to challenge a conviction? It's a twist that's left many scratching their heads and raises serious questions about our justice system. Buckle up, because this story is about to take us on a wild ride through the murky waters of criminal justice, political maneuvering, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Richard Glossop's name has been making headlines lately, but not for the reasons you might expect. Convicted of murder back in 1997, Glossop is now claiming that prosecutors withheld crucial evidence during his trial. But here's where things get interesting. Oklahoma's new Attorney General is actually supporting Glossop's claim. It's a surprising twist that's raised eyebrows across the legal community. But as we dig deeper into this case, we have to ask ourselves, is there more to this story than meets the eye? The answer, as we'll soon discover, is a resounding yes. On January 7, 1997, the quiet city of Oklahoma City was rocked by a grisly discovery. Barry Van Treese, owner of a local motel, was found dead in one of his own rooms. As investigators dug deeper, their attention quickly focused on Richard Glossop, the motel's manager. Glossop had been allowing the motel to fall into disrepair, and there were suspicions of embezzlement. Van Treese had reportedly planned to confront Glossop about these issues just a day before his disappearance. But according to Glossop, that confrontation never happened. As the investigation unfolded, a shocking twist emerged. Justin Sneed, a friend of Glossop's, confessed to the brutal murder. But here's where it gets even more chilling. Sneed claimed that Glossop had hired him to carry out the killing. This revelation set the stage for a complex legal battle that would span decades and eventually reach the highest court in the land. Richard Glossop's journey through the justice system has been a long and winding road. He was first convicted in 1998 for the murder of Barry Van Treese. However, this conviction was overturned due to ineffective assistance of counsel. In 2004, Glossop faced a second trial, where he was once again found guilty and sentenced to death. Over the years, Glossop's case has been scrutinized by multiple courts. Time and time again, his conviction and death sentence were upheld. It seemed like all avenues of appeal had been exhausted. So what changed? What brought this decades-old case back into the spotlight? The answer lies in a surprising turn of events that no one saw coming. A new player entered the scene, shaking up the long-held narrative surrounding Glossop's guilt. In a surprising turn of events, 2023 saw a significant shift in the Glossop case. Newly elected Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond decided to take a fresh look at the decades-old conviction. Drummond commissioned what he called an independent review of Glossop's case. This review, led by Drummond's longtime friend and political supporter Rex Duncan, claimed to uncover new evidence. The bombshell allegation? That prosecutors had withheld crucial information about Justin Sneed's psychiatric care during the original trial. This sudden revelation would set the stage for an unexpected alliance between Glossop and the state, challenging the very conviction Oklahoma had defended for years. At the heart of this case lies a shocking claim that prosecutors withheld crucial evidence about Justin Sneed's mental health. Glossop and the Oklahoma Attorney General assert that information about Sneed's lithium use and psychiatric care was kept from the defense. On the surface, it's a bombshell allegation that could overturn a decades-old conviction. But as we dig deeper, the story takes an unexpected turn. The alleged smoking gun? Handwritten notes from the prosecutor's interview with Sneed. These notes, we're told, prove that the prosecution knew about Sneed's psychiatric treatment and failed to disclose it. It's a claim that, if true, could be a textbook Brady violation, a serious breach of legal ethics. But here's where things get interesting. A closer examination of these notes paints a very different picture. What if these scribbled words don't represent the prosecution's secret knowledge, but instead record something else entirely? Could these notes actually be documenting questions that Glossop's own defense team had asked Sneed? As we peel back the layers of this case, we're left wondering, is this alleged Brady violation nothing more than a mirage? And if so, how did it make its way to the highest court in the land? Now, let's dive deeper into the heart of this case, the prosecutor's notes that are at the center of this controversy. When we take a closer look at these notes, a very different picture emerges from what Glossop and the Attorney General are claiming. The notes taken by prosecutors Connie Smotherman and Gary Ackley during their interview with Justin Sneed aren't actually recording new information about Sneed's mental health or medication. Instead, they're documenting Sneed's recollection of questions that Glossop's own defense team had asked him earlier. This is crucial. The very evidence that Glossop claims was withheld from him was, in fact, information originating from his own legal team. The notes show phrases like, "on lithium," and "Dr. Trumpet," but these aren't statements of fact. They're questions, indicated by the question marks, that Sneed says Glossop's lawyers had asked him. This context completely flips the script on the alleged Brady violation. If the prosecutors were simply writing down what Sneed told them about his interactions with Glossop's defense, how could this possibly be information withheld from the defense? It's a perplexing contradiction that raises serious questions about the validity of this entire Supreme Court case. Now, let's dive into a crucial piece of evidence that's been largely overlooked in this case: Ackley's notes. While the Attorney General has focused heavily on one prosecutor's notes, they've conveniently ignored another set that provides critical context. Ackley, who was present during the same interview as Smotherman, took his own notes. These notes interlock with Smotherman's and paint a very different picture from what the AG is claiming. They clearly show that the information about lithium and a doctor wasn't some hidden evidence, but rather questions that Glossop's own defense team had asked Sneed. So why were these notes omitted from the AG's presentation? It's a question that raises serious concerns about the integrity of their claim. Ackley's notes explicitly state that two women representing Glossop, an investigator and an attorney, visited Sneed and asked him about lithium. This omission isn't just a minor oversight. It completely undermines the alleged Brady violation. If the prosecutors were simply recording questions that Glossop's own team had asked, how could this possibly be evidence withheld from the defense? The selective presentation of evidence here is troubling. It suggests that rather than seeking the truth, there may be an attempt to construct a narrative that fits a predetermined conclusion. And that's not how our justice system is supposed to work. Now here's where things get really interesting. Records actually confirm that Glossop's defense team did visit Justin Sneed in prison. This isn't just speculation, it's documented fact. On April 16, 2001, Glossop's post-conviction attorney Wendy Hobbs, along with an investigator named Lisa Cooper, met with Sneed behind bars. During this meeting, Hobbs informed Sneed that Glossop might be getting a new trial and that Sneed could be called to testify again. They even had Sneed sign releases for various records: juvenile, jail, prison, and criminal. This visit lines up perfectly with what we see in the prosecutor's notes. Remember those references to two women, one possibly an investigator? It all fits. This isn't just a coincidence, it's a crucial piece of the puzzle. What does this mean for the case? Well, it strongly supports the interpretation that the prosecutor's notes were simply recording Sneed's account of the questions Glossop's own defense team had asked him. They weren't documenting some secret information about Sneed's medical history or psychiatric care. The implications of this case are staggering. If the prosecutor's notes indeed only record information already known to the defense, the entire foundation of this Supreme Court case crumbles. We're left with a chilling possibility that this alleged Brady violation is nothing more than a phantom claim. Think about it. If Glossop's defense team already knew about Sneed's lithium use and psychiatric care, how could the prosecution have withheld this information? It's a question that cuts to the very heart of this case. But the consequences stretch far beyond the courtroom. For Barry Van Treese's family, this case represents yet another twist in a decades-long nightmare. They've endured multiple trials, countless appeals, and now face the prospect of the Supreme Court potentially overturning Glossop's conviction based on what appears to be a misinterpretation of evidence. The emotional toll on the victim's family is immeasurable. They've been denied closure for over 25 years, and this latest development only prolongs their suffering. It raises serious questions about the balance between justice for the accused and justice for the victims. Moreover, this case sets a troubling precedent. If a conviction can be challenged based on such a tenuous claim, what does this mean for other cases? Could we see a flood of similar appeals, each based on reinterpretations of long-settled evidence? As we wrap up today's episode, we're left with troubling questions about the integrity of this case. The alleged Brady violation that brought Glossop v. Oklahoma to the Supreme Court seems to be built on shaky ground. Could this be nothing more than a phantom claim concocted from misinterpreted notes? The implications are staggering, not only for Richard Glossop and the state of Oklahoma, but for the family of Barry Van Treese, who have endured decades of legal battles. This case serves as a stark reminder of the complexities in our justice system and the potential consequences of misinterpreting evidence. What do you think? Could this entire Supreme Court case be based on a simple misunderstanding? Or is there more to the story that we're not seeing? We'd love to hear your thoughts on this perplexing case. Until next time, stay vigilant and keep questioning. There's always more beneath the surface in the world of true crime. Power, Pleasure, and Pain. A study of abuse through time. This book provides a detailed examination of how sexual violence and power dynamics have manifested across different historical periods, from ancient civilizations to the modern era. It explores how figures in positions of power used their influence to manipulate and exploit others, showing that the patterns of abuse we see today have deep historical roots. Many people struggle to grasp why abuse of power, particularly sexual violence, persists in modern society. By connecting historical events with contemporary cases, the book offers crucial insights into why such behaviors remain prevalent. The book analyzes infamous cases such as those of Harvey Weinstein, R. Kelly, and Dominique Pellicotte, drawing parallels between them and historical figures. This section highlights how the systemic abuse seen in recent times is not a new phenomenon, but part of an ongoing cultural issue. Through the lens of these modern examples, readers will gain a better understanding of how institutions, wealth, and power have historically shielded perpetrators from justice, contributing to their ability to continue harming others. The book explores the philosophy of libertarianism, particularly through the works of Marquis de Sade, to explain the disturbing ways in which pleasure, power, and cruelty have been intertwined. This provides readers with a deeper philosophical context to interpret modern-day scandals. Unlike other studies that